in the last several months, especially in the last month, you've had Turkey actually increasing its aggression inside of Syria toward the Kurds, right? Because Turkey has this huge issue with the Kurds. And U.S. forces happen to also occupy northeastern Syria, and Turkey also happens to be there as well. This has been going on for many years, and it really escalated when Russia intervened, and you had the U.S. occupy northern Syria and never left, and Turkey also stayed. Turkey has if you remember, in 2011, 12, 13, 14, those first 3-4 years of this dirty war on Syria led by the US and its Western allies, and of course, all of its allies and semi-allies in the region, you had what was called a rat line. You had a rat line of weapons, of US, NATO weaponry, of training facilities, these covert ops. You had CIA, you had the Pentagon, you had a lot of forces on this rat line training jihadists, training terrorists, training armed proxy groups, forces like al-Nusra Front to enter Syria and destabilize it. So that was happening in northern Syria, and that's why Turkey eventually occupied it, because then the United States started to support the Kurds, and Turkey doesn't like the Kurds. There started to be some conflict between the U.S. and Turkey, but where they aligned was the regime change operation that they wanted against Assad and the Syrian Ba'ath government. So that was going on to the tune of just thousands upon thousands of deaths, millions destabilized because of this dirty war, because of the U.S.'s literal use of al-Qaeda forces a la Libya to try to destabilize the country. Now, Syria and Turkey have had very bad relations because of this in recent years. They used to be partners, now they are not. But it is a huge deal that over the course of the last several months to a year, you've had more meetings between Syrian and Turkish officials, whether it's in the intelligence agencies and elsewhere. Now you have a meeting between the foreign ministry of Syria and the foreign ministry of Turkey. And the Duran covered this. And I'm going to play you the first 5 or 6 minutes of this. And then I'm going to show you the update, because now there is an update on this that we should be aware of. And that is an update that I think you will all find interesting, given the analysis that the good folks at the Duran are going to provide here. So let's begin with them and then a commentary. So I'll play you about 5 or 6 minutes of this.
Alexander, let's discuss the defense ministers' meeting and what is now looking like to be something that's inevitable, which is a rapprochement between Erdogan and Assad, Turkey and Syria. So we had the defense ministers of these countries get together and kind of lay down the groundwork for an eventual meeting of both leaders of these countries. Huge news if this does happen. Very, very big news if this happens. It's been a long 12 years now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Since Syria.
Exactly.
Yeah, 12 years.
A long, winding, twisted road, but we are almost there. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Erdogan was saying that in order for there to be a summit meeting, there has to be first a meeting of intelligence chiefs. Well, there have been several of those, Turkish and Syrian intelligence chiefs. There have been several of those already. Then he said the defense ministers need to meet. They've just done so. They met in Moscow. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, was present and he was mediating this meeting. So we had the Syrian and Turkish defense ministers meeting. And then Erdogan said after the defense ministers meet, the foreign ministers need to meet. And Cavusoglu, the Turkish foreign minister, has just said that he anticipates that there will be a meeting of foreign ministers, Syria, Russia, and Turkey, sometime in January. Early in 2023. He said that he's going to be meeting himself one-to-one with Lavrov fairly soon. So there'll be another meeting of the foreign ministers, and that will then clear the way for Assad and Erdogan finally to meet. And they used to be close friends and partners. They then went through this terrible war in which Erdogan attempted to overthrow Assad. That has clearly failed. he's got an election that he's got to win in a short time. He needs to try and get all those Syrian refugees back to Syria. He needs to find some way of ending this crisis in Syria, which has become very unpopular in Turkey. And he also needs Syria's support to deal with the Kurds. So that's the incentive for Erdogan to move. And for Assad, obviously, if Turkey closes the border to insurgencies, to Islamist insurgents, to jihadi groups, well, that is the effective end of the Syrian war.
So, I mean, this is all true. And I just want to add that this would be a huge deal if these two countries can come together and end. And now RT reported around the same time of this video that indeed Turkey has agreed to withdraw its military forces from northeastern Syria. Now, whether that's actually going to be applied or not is a big question, because Syria has been double-crossed many times before. Actually, probably the only country that hasn't double-crossed Syria has been Russia. If you remember, Russia came to help Syria in 2015 and actually helped very much so accelerate the victory that eventually happened in Aleppo and in key areas in Syria to essentially end the jihadist fighting that was going on, to give victory militarily to Syria and the Syrian government. But of course, the economic war kept going. The sanctions on Syria leveled by the United States, the Caesar sanctions, as well as the ongoing military coalition that continues airstrikes and, of course, occupying northeastern Syria, which includes Syria's water resources, oil resources, wheat, very key in resource-rich area, which the United States, along with Turkey, has been stealing Syria's resources, its wheat and its oil, and basically transporting it to Iraq, transporting it then to Turkey, right? There's been open looting going on in coordination with each other. So if Turkey is truly having somewhat of a dispute with the United States at this moment, is having problems internally when it comes to the consequences of what has happened in Syria. If there is going to be a change here, it could spell the end of the war on Syria, and that would be an amazing thing, given that all we've heard. And of course, Ukraine is very important, and Ukraine is certainly a flashpoint for the larger situation, the larger relationships that are developing between those forces who are trying to pry their way out of the empire's jaws and the empire itself. But Syria has been all but forgotten, and we can't forget Syria because, well, the war is still raging, and now we have these key developments. So let's finish up what the Duran has to say, and then I'll get to the update, because it's very important that we get to that update, which just happened today. Here we go.
That's left then is to tidy up the situation with the Kurds and to get the United States out of Syria, and with Turkey on board with Syria, to be straightforward about it. There's very little prospect of the United States being able to cling on. It would be regionally isolated, and the US troops in eastern Syria would be, frankly, at considerable risk if they stayed there.
A huge diplomatic win for Russia and for Putin. They've shown tremendous patience to try and get this deal worked out, and it looks like it's happening. And a huge loss for, I would say, the Obama administration, who started down this road of trying to overthrow Assad, and a massive loss for the neocons as well. What do you think they're going to try to do to spoil this as we head towards the finish line, the final stretch?
They're going to pull every single pull out every single stop, pull every string to try to get Erdogan defeated in the pending elections. Now, I don't think Erdogan will let that happen. I mean, I don't think that elections in Turkey are, fully free and fair anymore. I'm sorry to say that, but that's what I believe. And I think, besides which, Erdogan still has a critical mass of support within Turkey. and I think he'll be able to keep it together. But the way they will do that, the way they will try to undermine Erdogan's position, is by creating more problems in the Turkish economy. And of course, Turkey has high inflation. The lira has been, shall we say, unstable. Erdogan has idiosyncratic views about interest rates, which many people feel stand in the way of an economic stabilization in Turkey. And the United States still has substantial levers to create disruption within the Turkish economy. Now, in the past, whenever it looks like the lira was about to collapse, someone has stepped in to help stabilize it. And, we've never been told exactly who that someone is. It's unlikely to be the Russians, by the way, because I doubt they have the resources to do that. But given that the Russians and the Chinese are working very, very closely together, it might have been the Chinese, for all we know. But anyway, there's going to be a battle over the internal direction of Turkey. I should say that the Turkish opposition parties also support a rapprochement with Syria, but I suspect that nonetheless, the United States would rather see them in power than Erdogan, because Erdogan is such a powerful figure in Turkey. And the Russians, for their part, difficult partner that though they find Erdogan to be, would still prefer him in power, because ultimately he's the guarantor that this process will be continued through to its conclusion. So that's going to be the battle. It's going to be over the internal direction of Turkey, and you're going to see major attempts to try and destabilize the situation in Turkey. And indeed, just before we did this program, I saw reports of a major bomb attack in a Turkish city. And of course, remember, there's lots of Islamist groups, jihadi groups operating in Turkey. Who knows? Some of them may have the necessary contacts with our friends in Washington, and they might be activated as well.
So I just wanted to play that because I don't have disagreements with. I do believe that the United States has wanted to control if Erdogan wins, right, or if Erdogan is deposed, because you had a couple of years ago that possible coup attempt. You have forces aligned with the with the more liberal kind of pro-Western forces in Turkey, and you've had you've had attempts to destabilize Erdogan. There's no doubt. I believe that, yes, while Erdogan is not necessarily always an oppositional force to the United States and NATO, it's a NATO member. It does pose some problems, and this peace process is one of those big problems. However, Turkey has its own political agenda. I mean, Erdogan has for years, ever since he rose to power, has an agenda to make Turkey kind of this neo-Ottoman almost empire. It has its own imperial ambitions, which are in competition and ultimately sometimes in direct conflict with the United States' ambitions for the region. And so that's why you do have conflict between the two. And you have sometimes Turkey, right, getting closer to Russia, at times trying to get closer and mend relations with countries that it has conflicts with, Syria, Iran, for example. That's why you have these divisions. However, Turkey's trying to play all sides because Turkey has its own ambitions. And that's why, as you heard Alexander Mercouris say there, Russia, while it hasn't always been a friendship of convenience, it hasn't always been a friendship that's very trustworthy. Nonetheless, Erdogan is the best option out of likely the options like the Gulenists, for example. You have the Gulenists, who you have that horrific basketball player who you have what was his name, Fethullah Gulen, and he's retired. His name is escaping me. I've covered this so much. What's his name? Enes Kanter. You have Enes Kanter, right? These forces that that want to depose of Erdogan and want to basically open up Turkey full throttle, right? Not just, oh, be a part of NATO, not just work with international financial institutions, but make Turkey into essentially a Western protectorate. And Erdogan has neo-Ottoman ambitions, which means some semblance of sovereignty is necessary to get that done. But Turkey is still not always trustworthy. And so after the Duran reported this, right, today we had the Cradle, another really great resource to follow. You have to understand that Turkey is not necessarily the most trustworthy of partners in this multipolar moment, in this multipolar world that's emerging. Indeed, Turkey has its own ambitions, and that essentially the hope that Assad and Erdogan will meet is probably muted at this point. While it's a lot of progress has been made in potentially ejecting Turkey as an occupying force in Syria and maybe ending that war, that is moving in a positive direction. So there with the Duran guys, I have no disagreement. But now we have developments that show that things are a little more complicated, unfortunately, I think. You have the Turkish foreign minister right after his meeting with Syria's foreign minister meeting with the Syrian opposition. All right. And so on January 3rd, you had Turkish foreign minister Mevlut Cavusoglu held a meeting with the chairman of the National Coalition of Syrian Opposition and Revolutionary Forces, Salam El-Masset, and the president of Syrian Turkmen Assembly, Abdul Rahman Mustafa, according to the Anadolu news agency. We reiterate our support for the opposition and the Syrian people in accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, Cavusoglu said in a post on his Twitter profile, referring to a 2015 UN request for a political solution and ceasefire in Syria. The Turkish foreign minister's meeting with the Syrian opposition comes a week after Defense Minister Hulusi Akar met with his Syrian and Russian counterparts in Moscow, signaling a rapprochement between Ankara and Damascus. According to reports, the leaders and sympathizers of the Syrian opposition, who primarily live in the war-torn nation that Ankara indirectly control, the areas, the northeastern areas, are terrified of the rapprochement. So meanwhile, Cavusoglu stated that he anticipates meeting with Faisal Mekdad, his Syrian counterpart, in Moscow in the second half of January. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has proposed a meeting of foreign ministries after the defense discussions to perhaps set up a presidential summit. According to reports, however, President Bashar al-Assad will not agree to see Erdogan before Turkey's general election, which is slated for June. On the other hand, on the 5th of December, the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces announced a resumption of joint operations with U.S. forces in northern Syria following the tensions between the militia and Turkey. The spokesperson for the SDF refrained from commenting on this subject for the time being. So you have basically Turkey meeting with the Syrian opposition. Now, the Syrian opposition, unfortunately, is going to be a player in this. And so it's unclear how significant this is, whether this is kind of a breaking point. There's not going to be what the Duran was saying, what Mercouris was saying. There's not going to be a meeting between Assad and Erdogan before June. It's clear that Syria doesn't want to be part of Turkey's election ambitions. It doesn't want to be a part of that process. But also, right, Syria doesn't have plans on conceding to the Syrian opposition. It never did. It already did do that in 2012 with the parliamentary reforms. I don't know if you remember, but immediately after the so-called protests and then the violence broke out, Syria instituted immediate political reforms, included opposition parties into the parliament, many of whom had not been able to participate before, including opposition parties. And so no more concessions are going to be granted. So the fact that Turkey is still recognizing these forces as potential political players in some kind of solution does hint that Turkey doesn't have a 100% clear vision for peace with Syria's existing government, but in shaping some kind of political resolution that benefits itself as well as the larger situation, because Turkey does have an interest politically for peace because this war has been costly. It has cost a lot of people. Terrorist attacks have happened inside of Turkey. There's a lot of political problems that have occurred because of Turkey's unrepentant support for regime change against Syria. But now it's seeing that it is coming up in direct conflict with U.S. forces, the Kurdish forces that the U.S. is supporting in Syria, to try to hold together its own armed insurgency. So that's a big conflict for Turkey. The U.S. supporting Kurdish groups to try to overthrow Assad. Turkey sees that as directly in conflict with its own interests, because Turkey has basically a program for waging counter-terror operations and war on the Kurds. And this is a big conflict. This is one of the reasons why Sweden and Finland can't find their way into NATO, is because Turkey has said many times over that Sweden and Finland has condemned Turkey for its practices, its targeting of the Kurds, and that is in direct violation of its own sovereign interests. So it's not going to unanimously agree to allow Finland and Sweden to NATO. Now, I also think that Turkey doesn't want to backstab Russia. It has done so before. If you remember the downing of the Russian plane over this conflict during that war. So it's not like Putin and Erdogan, Russia and Turkey have the warmest of relations, but their partnership has grown pretty immensely in these last several years, in the last decade or so. And these two countries see it as within their interest to broker some kind of peace, but it will be a peace that Turkey wants to see benefit itself as well, despite the fact that it is an occupying force in Syria. We have to be clear about that. And so while you have the U.S. hoping to destabilize Turkey's political situation for its own ends, it wants to end any kind of opposition to its larger Cold War against Russia, against China. So it definitely does not want to see Erdogan pursue any kind of path that would undermine this. You also have Turkey and the United States cooperating in many ways while also being in conflict. So you have a lot of contradictions here that are going to play out. It's unclear where this exactly will go, but it's very important to understand that peace is actually moving forward, that there are really big steps, really huge steps, really important steps in this direction, and we have to understand that, we have to know this, and we have to continue to call for the end of the dirty war on Syria. This is something I've been covering since 2011. I've written dozens of articles about it. I've also covered it here on this channel. This is a dirty war. This is a proxy war. This is a war that's just as important as Ukraine. Why? Because you already have the same kind of great power conflict emerging in this country. You had Russian forces and U.S. forces coming into conflict with each other, coming into potential contact. I remember before my father died, he called me in I think it was 2017, early that year, when there was regular possible confrontation and escalation between Russian and U.S. forces inside of Syria because of the U.S.'s insistence of trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad and Russia's insistence that it wasn't going to let that happen. So I remember that very vividly, and I've covered this many times over. You had the missiles, right? The missiles in 2017 and 18 that the U.S. launched based on chemical weapons accusations, which people like Aramate have debunked. This atrocity propaganda against Syria. You have to learn from history. And history shows that whether it's Libya, whether it's Syria, or whether it's Ukraine, you have the same playbook, atrocity propaganda. Look at the Bucha massacre, right? Mariupol. They try to tell you that Russia's massacring people in order for you to support U.S. war efforts against Russia. Libya, Syria, these countries have all faced the same kind of propaganda war campaigns. China has faced it with Xinjiang, with Hong Kong. You see it over and over again. The playbook is the same. So we have to understand that the situation in Syria is reflective of this larger imperial agenda, this larger unipolar hegemon, this hegemonic system of empire that the United States is leading and is attempting to destabilize Syria so it can destabilize the region, so it can get to Russia and China. The road to Russia, to Moscow, to Beijing, according to U.S. warmongers, Western warmongers, neocons, is to pave the path in all regions of the world toward that end. And one of the biggest is the Arab world, is the Middle East, is the cradle of civilization. This entire region, the United States has spent destabilizing for many decades in order to get to this moment where it can feel like it's prepared to take on countries that are surpassing it, that are growing, that are becoming real challenges to the US's dominance economically, politically, and militarily in the world. That is the stakes here. That is the stakes in Syria. And it is good news that peace is making its a way forward, that there's progress, but we have to watch and see what happens with how Turkey continues to maneuver this process, because Turkey has not necessarily been a player that is willing to settle without its own imperial interests being met. And it has been met with much resistance from the West in this regard, as well as a resistance at times from Russia and from Syria and from other countries that have seen Turkey's nefarious dealings as big problems. So Turkey finds itself in the middle here, and we will see where that struggle ends up taking the world. But you heard it here first, that there is progress being made, and that is very good news.